In the remote highlands of eastern Anatolia, where the snow lies undisturbed for months and roads melt into rugged earth, once existed a village that few dared name, and fewer still remembered Beit al-Nisa, the House of Women. It wasn't found on any map. There were no signposts, no written records, no traders or travelers who passed through. The trees grew thick around it like sentinels, and the land itself seemed to whisper, "Stay away." For over 40 years, this secluded settlement housed hundreds of women, nearly 300 in total, under a religious doctrine so strict, so severe, that even the concept of identity was stripped away. They called it holiness, but in truth it was erasure. The women of Beit al-Nisa did not arrive there by accident. Some were brought by their families, convinced by local preachers that their daughters had the mark of silence, chosen for sacred life. Others were kidnapped from distant towns under the guise of rescue, and some were sold by fathers too poor or too proud to refuse. Once inside, they were given new names, if any at all. They were forbidden to speak without permission. Their words were counted, their voices monitored. Over time, many of the women forgot their original names. Imagine being 13 years old, arriving in a new place, and being told your past was a sin, your memories a distraction, and your only salvation was absolute silence. They wore long, hooded garments, gray as ash. Their heads remained bowed even when alone. They worked the land, sewed garments, and spent hours in collective prayer sessions that rarely involved actual prayer. Just long hours of kneeling, fasting, and listening to the decrees of the elders. The doctrine they followed was never written. It was passed orally by the male elders who controlled the outer village and the gate. These elders taught that God gave women beauty as both a blessing and a burden, and that to protect their purity, they must be hidden away, unheard, untouched by the world. They were taught, the less the world sees of you, the more God sees in you. A speaking woman disturbs the balance of heaven. Obedience is not silence, obedience is holy stillness. What these words really did was bind their minds in invisible chains. These women weren't living. They were preserved in spiritual ice, frozen by fear. The walls of Beit al-Nisa weren't made of stone, but of ritual, fear, and forgotten dreams, and the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a scream turned inward, the kind of silence where thoughts grow loud, where you hear your heartbeat like a threat. Even letters were banned. No paper was allowed unless it bore religious instruction. No outside mail was permitted. The women who tried to smuggle out messages, pleas for rescue or clues to their whereabouts, were punished with days of isolation, food deprivation, and public humiliation among their sisters. But worst of all was the indoctrination, the slow, relentless teaching that this was love, this was God's favor, this was sacred. Some believed it, many pretended to, and others slowly lost themselves to it entirely. There were no births, the women were not wives nor mothers. They were told they were brides of heaven, but there was no celebration in their marriage, only endless rituals and the haunting refrain of a future that never arrived. What they endured cannot be categorized only as religious extremism or cultural isolation. It was something deeper, systematic annihilation of spirit under the guise of devotion. The outside world did not know of Beit al-Nisa. Villagers from miles away spoke of the place where the women never return. Some thought it myth, some dark superstition, but no one dared investigate. The men who ran the compound were powerful, and they were protected by other men with influence, wealth, and scripture misused as armor. To this day, not a single photograph of the original village has been found. Only whispers, third-hand stories, and the rare surviving account of those who escaped. But the legacy of that place remains as a warning, a reminder that faith, when corrupted by control, becomes a prison. Beit al-Nisa is not just a place that disappeared. It is a mirror held up to the world, a reflection of what happens when we allow silence to grow louder than justice, when women are taught that invisibility is virtue, when questions are labeled sin, when identity is swallowed in the name of submission. In the silence of that forgotten village, a lie was told for decades: you are nothing if unseen. But the truth, buried beneath snow and doctrine, was always this: you own nothing if you don't own yourself. To the outsider, the doctrine seemed like religion, cloaked in sacred verses, rituals, and references to divine purpose. it was easy to assume that what governed the women of Beit al-Nisa was spirituality. But look closer, and you'd see it for what it truly was: a weaponized belief system designed to control, manipulate, and erase. This was not faith. It was submission masquerading as salvation. The doctrine preached a simple but devastating principle: a woman's greatest virtue is her silence, her greatest reward, her disappearance. This teaching was never challenged, because from the day these women entered the community, whether by choice, force, or deception, they were told it came from God Himself, and to question it was to rebel against the divine. That's how powerful doctrines work, not with chains but with conviction, and that is what made it nearly impossible to escape. The doctrine was delivered daily, through prayers, morning rituals, and controlled conversations. It echoed in the air like a hymn, but what it really taught was obedience, isolation, and unworthiness. Women were taught to see themselves not as whole beings, but as vessels of temptation and symbols of divine fragility. They were told that if their voice was heard, it could disturb a man's soul, that if their thoughts were shared, it could lead others astray. So they were silenced not just physically, but mentally. Their identity was not only hidden from the world, it was buried within themselves. And the terrifying part, some began to believe it. They began to believe that submission was holy, that desire for self-expression was sinful, that visibility was dangerous. Over time, this wasn't just doctrine, it became their identity. The enforcers of this belief were not just men. Some of the older women, broken and conditioned by decades inside the system, had become its gatekeepers. They patrolled the corridors, led the rituals, and repeated the teachings. Not out of cruelty, but because they believed it was the only path to heaven. And that's the brutal truth. When a lie is wrapped in sacred language, it no longer feels like a lie. It feels like duty. Imagine being raised in a place where your worth was measured by your disappearance, where the less you existed, the more righteous you were seen, where silence wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced by prayer and punishment alike. This doctrine didn't just demand submission, it demanded obliteration of the self. The men who created and protected the doctrine used scripture like scaffolding, building walls around the women's minds. They hand-picked verses, distorted meanings, and conveniently forgot context. They made sure the women had no access to outside education, no visitors, and no opportunity to hear a second opinion. They made sure the only voice the women ever heard was theirs. Even their sacred texts were edited. Removed were the verses of equality, compassion, and freedom. Left were the ones about obedience, modesty, and eternal consequence. These fragments, repeated in sermons and rituals, became truths carved into the soul. And over time, those women forgot who they were, forgot where they came from, forgot that outside those wooden walls, a world still existed where choice, freedom, and dignity were possible. But here's the part history almost never mentions. Doctrines like this don't just disappear, they adapt. The village may be gone, the leaders may be dead, the buildings may have collapsed, but the thinking, the belief that women must shrink to be righteous, that faith demands disappearance, that obedience is the only virtue, it still exists, in quiet corners of modern society, in subtle teachings, in whispered expectations, in cultures where a girl's voice is seen as a threat and her independence as defiance. And that is why this story matters. Because the doctrine that erased 300 women wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a warning for the future. When religion becomes a tool for control, it ceases to be holy. When silence is demanded in the name of virtue, it breeds fear, not faith. And when doctrine is used to erase rather than empower, it becomes violence disguised as devotion. We must never forget what happened in that village, not because we wish to dwell in pain, but because every time we tell this story, we chip away at the lies used to silence generations. True faith does not require your disappearance. It calls for your presence. Bold, free, and unafraid, she was known as Sister Miriam, but that was not her name. It was the name they gave her the moment she crossed the gates of Beit al-Nisa, the cloistered religious compound nestled deep in the mountain woods, a name that meant obedient, devoted, quiet, a name meant to erase her past and reshape her future. A name whispered in prayers and reinforced through punishment, but her real name, her true name, was Anara. She didn't speak it aloud for 19 years. She held it inside like a dying ember, hidden in the ashes of who she used to be. Each night, as she lay on the straw mat inside her assigned cell, she would whisper it in her mind, Anara, 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 a quiet rebellion, a sacred preservation, a lifeline to a self that refused to die. Anara had arrived at the compound at age 16. Her father, swept into the cult's ideology, believed it would purify her soul and protect her from the moral decay of the outside world. Her mother wept silently, standing by the gate as her only daughter was led into a life of holy silence. Anara didn't cry. She watched the door close behind her and knew that a chapter had ended. She was told to forget the world she came from, her family, her books, her questions, her voice, but she didn't. Not completely. In the early years, she tried to fit in out of fear, mostly. She repeated the chants, bowed during the rites, kept her eyes lowered. She tried to erase herself like the others had, but something in her resisted. It was in the way she watched, how she listened, how she memorized not just the teachings, but the holes in them, the contradictions, the manipulations. She saw how Sister Alima flinched every time a male elder passed, how Sister Zara cried softly during midnight prayer, how some girls never came back from the cleansing quarters. She noticed, and she remembered, at the heart of the doctrine was this: if a woman forgets who she is, she cannot rebel. That's why they took the names, that's why they removed mirrors, that's why they banned writing. Identity was dangerous, but Anara's mind was her fortress. She remembered her childhood, her brother's laugh, the smell of her mother's kitchen, the pages of her favorite book, and most of all, her name. She would etch it with her fingernail into the underside of her wooden bunk. Ayin, Ray, a small act, but revolutionary. It meant she still belonged to herself. By the time she was 30, Anara had become a mentor to some of the younger girls. The elders thought she was finally refined, submissive enough to trust. They had no idea that beneath her calm face, a fire still burned. One girl, Lena, only 14, once came to her in tears after being punished for asking what was outside the compound. Anara didn't scold her. She didn't repeat the doctrine. She looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Don't ever forget your name." That moment sparked something neither of them could undo. Anara began teaching in secret, not scripture, but memory. She would find quiet moments to whisper to the girls, "What's your favorite color? What did your house look like? Who did you want to be before they told you who to be?" The girls began remembering. Some wept, some smiled, some trembled with the unfamiliar joy of identity. They weren't just bodies in robes anymore. They were daughters, artists, dreamers. And just like that, the doctrine began to fracture, because it turns out you can't fully control someone who remembers who they are. Anara never escaped the compound physically. She died inside those walls at the age of 42, her health worn down by years of hard labor and malnutrition. Her death was announced during morning prayer with only the name Sister Miriam. But the women she reached, they survived. Some escaped, some exposed the truth. One, Linus, muggled out a list of real names etched into cloth scraps. It became evidence in an investigation. It was Anara's list. Her legacy wasn't rebellion in the traditional sense. It was remembrance. And in a place built on erasure, remembering was more powerful than fire. Let this be the lesson. They can change your name, strip your clothes, cage your body, but if you remember who you are, they cannot truly own you. Anara never shouted, never ran, never raised a weapon. She simply refused to forget, and because of that, the world eventually remembered her too, not as Sister Miriam, but as Anara, the one who remembered her name. It began without a sound, no shouting. No slamming doors, no alarms, just footsteps, soft and rhythmic, on the cracked stone paths of the Beit al-Nisa compound, and in every hand a lantern, not electric, not loud, but old-fashioned oil-fed, with wicks trimmed just enough to glow without flicker. 300 women walked through the darkness together, holding not just light, but memory, dignity, and the weight of a decision that could cost them everything. It would later be called the Night of 300 Lights, but to the women who lived it, it was the first breath of freedom after decades of suffocation. The plan had no single leader. It was born in whispers, hidden notes, and stolen seconds between forced prayers and chore rotations. Each woman only knew a fraction of the whole scheme, so if one was caught, the rest could still carry on. But it had been Lena, now 27, who carried the fire forward. She had remembered what Anara had told her all those years ago. Don't ever forget your name. So she remembered, and then she planned. With the help of 3 elder women and a sympathetic groundskeeper who had once lost his own daughter to the cult, she mapped every guard rotation, every unlocked maintenance door, and even the loose stones along the perimeter wall. It took 2 years. 2 years of hiding supplies in burial sheds, sewing travel clothes from scraps, training the weak and the injured how to walk long distances. 2 years of praying the younger girls wouldn't panic and alert the elders. 2 years of gathering courage, and when it was time, she lit the first lantern, then passed it on. The escape was set for the winter solstice, the darkest night of the year. They believed the shadows would protect them. But it wasn't just about darkness. The solstice was also a sacred night in the compound, marked by long ritual fasting and indoor prayer. The elders would be locked away in seclusion. The gates, by ancient tradition, remained closed but unguarded. It was the only window, and there wouldn't be another at precisely 2:17 a.m. The first woman stepped out of her assigned cell and walked toward the outer path, then another, then 10, then hundreds. No one spoke. Their footsteps became a heartbeat, their lights an unspoken vow. As they walked, memories resurfaced like waves. Some had not spoken their real names in over 20 years. Others had never left the compound since they were toddlers. Many had scars, from beatings, from silence, from giving birth and having their children taken. And yet they moved, not as victims, but as survivors. Each lantern carried a name, etched in thread, sewn into lining, whispered into flame. This is for Amira, this is for Hala, this is for myself. Even the women who were too old or too sick to walk were carried on carts, on shoulders, in wheelbarrows. No one was left behind. That had been the rule from the beginning. We go together, Lena had said, or we don't go at all. They reached the outer fence, 7 feet high and lined with thorns. A group of women, led by a former herbalist named Warda, used shears and cloth wraps to quietly break through. It took 19 minutes. Every second felt like thunder in their ears, but the gods never came. By 3:04 a.m., the first lantern passed through the broken fence, then another, then hundreds. The path on the other side was forested, damp, and unfamiliar. But it smelled like freedom. It sounded like possibility. The lanterns lit the way as the women disappeared into the trees, vanishing not in fear but in dignity. In the days that followed, the cult declared them lost to the darkness. Local news outlets initially ran cold stories. Mass disappearance at religious compound. Authorities investigate possible suicide pact. But the truth was different. Within weeks, testimonies began surfacing. Women reached safe houses and contacted journalists. Lena gave her first public statement from a hidden shelter in Ankara. We did not disappear. We returned. Soon, a wave of survivor stories, smuggled letters, audio recordings, and secret photographs began unraveling the lies. Public outrage followed. International investigators were brought in. The Beit al-Nisa compound was raided. The elders were arrested, and the world finally saw the light that had burned in silence for decades. The Night of 300 Lights was not just an escape. It was a revolution without weapons, a protest without shouting, a rebellion born in stillness. The women who walked that path proved something history often forgets. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in silence. No flags, no cameras, no chants, just feet on stone, hands on lanterns, and names carried like fire. Freedom, they discovered, was not a door that simply opened. It was a path, and that path didn't end at the broken fence. It was just the beginning of another kind of journey, the long, painful, and beautiful road to healing. For the women who escaped the Beit al-Nisa compound during the Night of 300 Lights, the hardest part wasn't fleeing, it was learning to live again. Because while their bodies were free, their minds still carried chains. In the early months after the escape, survivors were scattered across safe houses and shelters in multiple countries. Some had made it to Turkey, others into Lebanon, and a few as far as southern Europe. Governments and human rights groups worked frantically to find space for them, but resources were strained. Some women shared mattresses, food, even clothing. Yet they were used to scarcity. What they weren't used to was choice. The silence that had once protected them now felt suffocating. Many women would sit in corners for hours, unsure if they were allowed to speak. Some still instinctively asked for permission to eat, to sleep, to bathe. Therapists described it as institutional trauma, but it was deeper than that. These were not just former members of a strict order. They were women who had been systematically erased. Their memories, their language, their individuality, stripped away over decades by a doctrine that demanded submission and offered nothing in return. The turning point came not from international aid, but from within. Lena, who had become the reluctant face of the escape, refused to let the movement die in shadows. She gathered 8 women who felt strong enough, and together they created the Namira Initiative, named after a woman who had died during childbirth in the compound. Her name never spoken aloud again. The initiative's mission was simple: rebuild, restore, remember. They began hosting healing circles, first in secret, then in public. Survivors were encouraged to write their names on a piece of paper and place it in a bowl of water, watching the ink expand and float, symbolizing the return of their identity. Others sang, songs remembered from childhood before the compound. Some drew, painted, danced. A woman named Huda carved small wooden statues of birds and placed them in parks around the city. For every woman still in a cage, she said, still, not every story ended in triumph. Some women couldn't adapt. The trauma ran too deep. Nightmares haunted their sleep, and sounds from crowded streets triggered panic attacks. A few returned to isolated lives, unable to trust the world, even if it was freer now. And yet, healing is not about erasing pain, it's about learning how to live with it, without being owned by it. One of the most powerful moments came during the first official gathering of the Namira Initiative, nearly 2 years after the escape. Over 170 women attended, some with children, some holding each other, many meeting again for the first time since that night. Lena stood on stage and read from a journal she had kept hidden in the lining of her dress during the escape. We did not break free only to be forgotten. We are not shadows. We are not shame. We are the daughters of silence, learning how to sing. The crowd didn't clap. They wept, and then they stood. The healing years were not marked by headlines, but by everyday victories. The woman who opened her first bank account in her real name. The teenager who finally went to school at age 16. The mother who found the daughter taken from her at birth. The elder who learned how to use a phone and called her sister after 30 years of silence. Each life became a testament to survival, to endurance, to the power of a name spoken out loud. Today, the story of the 300 vanished women is taught in human rights classes across the world. Documentaries have been made, books published. A small museum now stands near the ruins of the Beit el-Nisa compound, not a place of horror, but of remembrance and testimony. The night of 300 lights is no longer a mystery. It is a symbol of what happens when courage is shared. Of what healing looks like after history forgets you, of what light can do in the hands of the silenced, because in the end they did not just escape, they reclaimed, they rebuilt, they remembered, and from the shadows they stepped into light, together. History repeats itself, not because time forgets, but because people do. The story of the 300 women who vanished under the cloak of religious doctrine is more than a horrifying tale of silence, submission, and systemic erasure. It is a warning, a call to vigilance, and a reminder that the line between devotion and domination is thinner than we think. What happened in the hidden commune of Beit el-Nisa wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a carefully constructed system. A doctrine dressed in piety, a cage disguised as protection, and the world looked away. It always begins with fear. Fear of the outside world, fear of corruption, fear of independence masked as rebellion. The founders of the doctrine preyed on fear, teaching followers that the world was wicked, and only within the fold could they remain pure. So they cut the outside world off. No letters, no phones, no guests. No news. Then came the rules, wrapped in sacred language but soaked in control. Obedience was spiritual, silence was holy, questioning was sin. The women who disappeared didn't do so all at once. They vanished gradually, year by year, voice by voice, right before the world's eyes, through propaganda, isolation, and forced piety, until they were ghosts in their own lives, and when the last ones escaped, it was not only to flee a place, but to expose a pattern. The world must learn. Doctrine without accountability becomes dangerous. We must examine every structure, religious, cultural, educational, that demands unquestioning submission. When faith demands silence, it is not faith, it is fear. And when leaders place themselves above scrutiny, they are no longer shepherds, but tyrants cloaked in robes. Even today, across nations and faiths, there are still sects where women are told to never look men in the eyes, to marry whom they are assigned, to accept pain as purification, to bury their dreams for the sake of honor. This is not culture, this is not religion, this is oppression disguised as sanctity. But the story of the 300 women is not just a warning, it is a call. A call to survivors. You are not what was done to you. You are not erased. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. There is power in your story. There is strength in your scars. And there is healing in your truth. To advocates, never underestimate your voice. It was a single outsider, a school teacher, who first raised questions about the commune's secrecy. She wrote letters, filed reports, and was ignored for years. But she never stopped. Her persistence lit the first spark of rescue. To governments, protection must not be political. Too often, law enforcement turns a blind eye to religious autonomy at the cost of human rights. No belief system should shield abuse. No leader should be beyond the reach of justice, and no border should be a barrier to rescue. To leaders of faith, shepherd your people, do not imprison them. A true leader empowers, uplifts, listens. They protect the vulnerable, not exploit them, and they serve truth, not control. If your followers are afraid to leave, you are not guiding a flock. You are holding hostages, and to the world at large, watch the women. Because when women begin to vanish, not physically but in voice, in power, in rights, civilization is quietly unraveling. Do not wait until it becomes a headline. Do not wait until it becomes a documentary. Do not wait until someone disappears forever. Ask the hard questions, demand transparency, challenge silence. One of the escapees, an elder woman named Salima, once said, "I was born with a name, then they gave me a number. I was born with a voice, then they gave me silence. I escaped with nothing, except my memory, and that is enough to bring it all down." She lived the rest of her life writing and speaking across the world, telling anyone who would listen, do not look away when a woman disappears. She is not vanishing, she is being erased, and if it can happen to her, it can happen to you. The veil has been lifted. The world cannot claim ignorance anymore. Let the story of these 300 women be more than a tragedy. Let it be a turning point, a reminder, a revolution, because what happened once must never happen again.